lull in the banter. Welcome to today's Frontiers in the Environment. If you're live tweeting today, we have the hashtag Frontiers. And as you know, we've been talking about big questions this semester. Today's big question, how can infrastructure support sustainable urban living? And to talk about that today, we have Dr. Anu Ramaswamy. She's an Institute on the Environment Fellow and the Charles M. Denny Jr. Chair of Science, Technology, and Public Policy in the Humphrey School of Public Affairs. Anu, thank you for coming.
All right.
It's all yours.
So thank you all for joining us here today. And as Louis said, I'm going to talk about infrastructure and how it can promote sustainability and human well-being in cities. I want to quickly acknowledge a couple of NSF grants that have helped produce this work. One of them is a PIRE, Partnerships in International Research and Education, and the latest one is a Sustainability Research Network grant. And I want to really acknowledge all the students and faculty on our grants that made all this work possible. This is from a recent trip to India with our colleagues from China joining us as well. So it was just great to have so many people on this team. And I'm going to be describing work done over the past, I would say, about 10 years, and sort of building up to where it is now, but mostly leave it with open-ended questions as to where we're going in the future. So why do we care about cities and infrastructure? By the year 2050, I think we all know this, 2/3 of the world's population will be urban, but I think what very few people know is that 60% of those future cities haven't yet been built. And so there's a huge opportunity to be thinking of that future infrastructure, because infrastructure has such very, very long time spans. And so if we can think now and get it right now to try to achieve these twin goals of environmental sustainability and human well-being, it'll really address some of our sustainability issues globally. And so the question is, how can we think of reimagining or rethinking our infrastructure, not city by city, but actually in all sorts of cities in different parts of the world? And so we'll talk towards the end about types of cities, and are there certain interventions in certain types of cities. And I wanted to emphasize that our focus is on 7 sectors. And so these are not traditional infrastructure, some of them are, and the 7 sectors are energy supply, buildings, transportation, and connectivity, and food supply. And so food isn't often considered an infrastructure, but we've been studying it as part of essential services in cities since 2005. Water supply, sanitation and waste, and public spaces. And livability is sort of the characteristics of a space, and we're looking at what characteristics of a space helps make it environmentally sustainable, which means for us reducing resource use and pollution, helps advance human health status of people living in cities, and typically these are measured using direct metrics like mortality and morbidity and disease burden. And we're also interested in subjective well-being, also loosely called happiness, right? And so we're interested in that because we're interested in how people think and feel about their life in the city. And this includes things like safety, security, livelihoods. And we actually wanted to emphasize that it's not just the absence of disease, but people feeling well, actively liking to be in the city that we're after over here. Okay? And so the question is, how can these 7 sectors embedded in social and natural systems shape these outcomes that we're interested in? And so with that backdrop, I wanted to explain why we picked these 7 sectors. And this is a graph. I'll go over it a bit slowly because there's a lot of information. And this is showing annual greenhouse gas emissions across the whole country for the United States in 2005. This is showing water withdrawals. So this is all aggregated across the country. And then on this side, you're seeing results from the Global Burden of Disease study, which is showing mortality because of environment or infrastructure-related causes globally. And so when you look at this, you're seeing that those 7 sectors we just talked about, you can actually get a sense altogether how much impact they're having on water, on energy, and on health. And so you can obviously see energy supply is huge, residential, commercial, and industrial energy use. This is municipal water supply in blue. The pink, the colors got a little weird here. The pink are just tailpipe emissions, exposure to particulate matter. And in fact, statistics are showing that about 5,000 people are dying, I think, annually in India, and 5,000 people. There's excess mortalities in millions in India and China together. And so this is a really big piece. And then this is showing the impact of our food system. So what's the impact of childhood underweight, so undernutrition, as well as the opposite. Under transportation, we also talk about reduced mobility, lack of fruits and vegetables. And so it's a bigger view of infrastructure. So those 7 sectors we feel are really important to shape both environment and well-being. And so with that background, in today's talk, I'm going to acknowledge 5 complexities. What you just saw was at the national scale. If you were to bring this down to the scale of a city, it's complicated and it's complex. And there's 5, at least I've outlined 5 reasons. So we'll talk about those 5 reasons. Then we'll talk about a key challenge if we want to advance towards sustainability and well-being. And then potentially talk about a few solutions. Okay. So one of the first things about cities is that they're really much smaller than the bigger system out of them. They're actually smaller than the infrastructure system itself that serves them. And you can see this over here, that typically we do studies at the neighborhood level, or we do urban metabolism studies at the city boundary. So if you imagine this to be a city boundary, a lot of work in urban metabolism goes into tracking material and energy flows and the stock over long periods of time. But a lot of the infrastructures that you see over here, the buildings, the energy supply, a lot of that typically happens outside the city boundaries. So most cities get electricity from outside. Almost all cities get the bulk of their food from outside. So if you look at our sectors, you need to look much further upstream. And here you start connecting with life cycle assessment and industrial ecology to connect all the way to the natural system. And this helps us develop footprints. And so these are footprints. You can define footprints in terms of resource use, energy use, water use. You could also think of pollution. And for something like greenhouse gases that are globally, you're looking at warming, you can add up the impact across scale in the form of these footprints. And so these footprints are separated by the pollutant, by the resource. And we also study at the bottom the drivers, who are the actors and the institutions that shape people's behaviors that has all this happening. And so the scale issue becomes the first complexity. So I promised you 5. And so the first complexity is this thing, that cities exert an impact well beyond their boundary. And most conversations about sustainability, if they happen only within the city space, you've missed a vast amount of the impact cities have on the environment. And so for here, I'm showing you the 7 sectors, and we've done these sorts of studies in many, many cities in many parts of the world, starting with Denver. I was at the University of Colorado, and people said, oh, Denver, it's not a global city. So we did Denver, we did Delhi, we did Beijing, 17 million, 18 million, 19 million, and it's the same. All those cities as well get a lot of stuff from outside. And so here's an example that Delhi imports. You can see all these really basic services without which a city can't function. Delhi imports 55% of its electricity, 100% of its cement, 90% of its food, almost all its petrofuels. We know that food travels long distances, freight travels 600 miles. And so the idea is that we shouldn't be studying cities just within their boundary. We should be looking at their linkages across scale through these footprints. And here's a picture of what a greenhouse gas emission footprint for infrastructure supply looks for Denver. And if you look at it, you can see that the hatched marks are showing you the supply that's coming from outside the city boundary, what I just told you, that cities get so much of it. And so it's remarkable to see it together, that of all these sectors, 7 sectors, if you look at the supply of these sectors to a city, a vast majority, more than 50%, is coming from outside the boundary. And then you can see some of the things that are happening inside the boundary. These are tailpipes. So actually, if you look at it, all the blues are building energy use. All the oranges are transportation-related emissions. The green is fuel processing to make that transportation happen. The purple is cement. This is food supply, water, wastewater treatment, and waste. So first off, it gives you a context. Very few people study all sectors together, so it puts all sectors together and gives you a context. Right? We're all in academia, right? We all think our favorite sector is the most important thing. And so it just sort of gives you a context. How big is water, wastewater compared to all the other sectors? And then you start looking at things, previously cities were not counting. They were counting only this, maybe electricity, but not things like air travel, cement. And so this was actually a really big game changer for Denver, because they hadn't consciously thought about the materials they were using even as city government. And so they were actually completely blown away that the embedded energy or the embodied energy to make cement and maintain the city every year was actually more than city government. And so city government is not shown here, but it was about this was cement is 2%, and this is what is a sliver here. And it really changed the mayor's thinking, the council's thinking, and the first thing they did was they passed a law, because the city of Denver, it's the city and county of Denver, they manage all their public works, they manage all their repair, concrete works. They started incorporating fly ash, which is a substitute for cement, across all their, it actually was passed by mayoral decree about 6 months after we did this for Denver. So it was sort of the first taste of how you can actually impact policy by working closely with cities. And then a few other things happened. I can talk later about it. We actually then started working with Denver on developing wedges. We've all heard about, and I'll show some of those coming up. So this is the first complexity, that you want to look outside the boundary. The second complexity, and I'm sure someone in the audience is thinking, but we don't only care about carbon. And you're absolutely right. We don't only care about greenhouse gases. We care about air pollution. We care about water. We care about nutrients. We care about land. And this sort of analysis, footprinting, allows you to develop footprints separated for each of these resources. So it's different from the traditional the earlier aggregate footprints that we've been used to. This separates it out by resources, by pollution streams. So now you can start connecting these to some nexus issues, which I'm going to talk about. So this is the second complexity. And the complexity here is that our resources are connected with each other. Water is needed to make energy. Our energy resources are needed for the water system. And so we took this analysis further and started looking at coupling energy and water footprints for supplying food, energy, water to cities. The few that's high on everyone's horizon right now. And so this is a framework for showing what we did. We looked at the city boundary, and the city consists of homes, businesses, and industry. This is the city boundary. You could look at homes, businesses, and industry using food or agri-food, using energy, using water, and you can also think of interactions between them. This is energy for cooking food, making food, preserving food, water for urban agriculture, for cooking food. You can see all these interactions, food waste going to energy, and you can also supply some of this locally. We do have urban agriculture, we do have groundwater withdrawals, we do have local energy production, but what I just showed you tells you it's not nearly enough. And so it's really important for us to start thinking of these transboundary supplies. So you have transboundary energy production and storage with its embodied water. You have transboundary water storage with its embodied energy. And of course, food, which needs both energy and water. And so that's the second complexity of how do you start to work out the connections across resources that are interlinked. And I won't get into the detail, but you can see that based on how much stuff is produced locally among food, electricity, water, and petrofuels, you can start seeing what your water footprint is and what your greenhouse gas footprint is. And if you were in a water scarce region and you also cared about climate and carbon mitigation, you can start identifying where to focus your attention. So that's the second complexity. And then the third one is that all these interactions affect ecosystem services, which in turn affect our sense of well-being and our health. And so we have really multiple and multi-scale health risks. And I'll show that in just a minute. You could have risks, and those risks are actually exacerbated because of inequities. And urban areas are just incredibly, in so many cities, the inequity is so sharp. And so when you talk about health and well-being, the inequity in infrastructure supply, in access to ecosystem services, so how do you put all that together? That's really quite complex. And at the same time, I don't want to present it as all negative, because some of these areas this is in fact, if you look at the slum in Dharavi, and slum in many parts of the world, Dharavi is in Mumbai, they say that studies have been done there that faster than any other generation, people are going to college, people are getting jobs. So these are not just areas that are completely desolate, they're also opportunities where people come through the city. And one of the things we've been talking about is how can cities actually help make this transition happen for the migrants? All cities have migrants. And the question is, do you put them here with this big separation, or do you actually engage them? How do we think about health when there's so much inequity? And so that's the fourth complexity. And the fifth one is then if you think about happiness, and we actually just did this, we surveyed people in different socioeconomic strata in India, in Delhi, in slum areas and non-slum areas, and it's just amazing. And the amazing thing, first of all, is no one can agree how to agree on what happiness is. And so there's three broad ways of judging happiness, and one of them is called life evaluation, which is asking you to think about how you evaluate your life against the best possible life for you. That's how the question's worded. The second one is asking you, how do you feel? And there's a range of emotions, positive and negative emotions, and it's more short term. And there's a lot of studies that say, we shouldn't just ask these two, we should also think about life purpose. And so often you could have people who have all the amenities, but they just don't have a purpose, and they're probably never happy. And so there's a lot of research across many disciplines talking about happiness. And there's a great report called the World Happiness Report that actually came out from the Earth Institute. And what it's saying is, if you wanted to develop policy to enhance human well-being, you don't even know what to ask, or you don't even know how to ask it, right? And so it sort of makes you wish we would just work in the world of dollars and cents and rupees, right? Instead of doing all this. All right. But that's the heart of this. If we're trying to make infrastructures to be environmentally sustainable, healthy with the traditional metrics of health like mortality and morbidity, but also capture the sense of well-being, it is complex. And so for this complexity, we have a framework which we call a SEIS framework, Social, Ecological, or Environmental Infrastructural Systems Framework. And the framework is actually what I showed you early on. For the infrastructure, we have neighborhoods, city boundaries, the industrial system, the natural system, We have infrastructures that span scale. We have footprints of resource use, which you just saw. But we can now start connecting the pollution with health impacts, with ecosystem impacts. And what we're doing in our program is this sort of multidimensional impact assessment, multi-scalar, multidimensional of infrastructure, and looking at things from the home scale to the community scale to the global scale with various actors. And the things we're looking at in terms of well-being would be things in the home. You saw those slum areas. Do they have adequate sanitation, piped water? At the community scale, do people feel safe? Do they have security from disasters? Do they have access to parks and recreational services? At the regional scale, we could think of air pollution, climate impacts, and at the global scale, global change, but also big changes in trade. The communities are really impacted by that. And so, fortunately, and look at the outcomes, fortunately, this is not work we're doing alone. So we are doing this as part of the network. The network has about 24 faculty across about 12 universities coming from different disciplines. And that's the framework that pulls it together. And what I'm going to do is probably just show you a few more hopeful things about solutions and related to some of the work we're doing. This is work in progress. But I can sort of talk to solutions and then open it up for questions. I think I'll be probably good with half an hour left. Okay. So the key challenge. So I promised you 8 complexities and 1 key challenge. And the key challenge, which I think we finally articulated, is that it doesn't help to putter around the edges. If you really want to achieve these, you have to do like a factor 10 or more efficiency, because when people come to cities, they become wealthier, as they should, as we would like them to, as they would like to be. And their consumption increases. And so if you have to keep up with that, you have to, first of all, build infrastructure well and fast, but also really extremely efficiently. And it's not just 2x or 3x. You've seen the factor X conversations. It's probably got to be 10x or more. So that's the big challenge. And there's been studies by Daniel Kahneman and Deaton. They do a lot of studies on life evaluation. And they have a very interesting paper in the PNAS, which looks at emotional well-being and life satisfaction. And emotional well-being is how your anger, your emotions, both of them are tracking together at low income in the US. But after about 70,000, people are sort of emotional well-being sort of elbows, plateaus, but life satisfaction or life evaluation keeps going up and up and up. So unless we rethink how we evaluate our lives, there is, at the current time, this sort of interest in wealth and growth and whatever it is. So unless we have a big change in how we think about our lives, we are going to have a 10x efficiency. So there's, on the one hand, you can change how we think. There's a big, lots of movement around how we think about happiness, what makes us content. But my talk is about infrastructure. And so what I'm going to tell you is, if you want to take care of all of that, if you want to compensate and do beyond compensation, if you want to do better, we have to be 10x or more efficient. And so tweaking around the edges of what we have today is not enough. It took me a while to realize that. So when I worked in Denver and many other cities, we would try all these. So the first time we worked in Denver, the goal of the city and county of Denver was to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions by 10%. Right? And so I was like, what? And I was like, why can't you be more ambitious? What is this goal? And then when we started doing the analysis, we realized how incredibly difficult it was to reach 10%. And I'll show you that. And because all the things that we could do was the tweaking. And so I'll show you that in just a minute. And so for a while, I think I even depressed all the students, because we used to do these calculations that unless you made something a regulation, it would barely bend the needle or bend the curve. unless you made something that everyone did. And you'll see it, you can barely bend the curve. And so what we have now concluded after many years of mildly depressing students is, and myself, is that if you really want to do that sort of change, you have to do it systemically. And a good example is if you think of industry, right? So if your industry wanted to be extremely energy efficient, after some time it's going to cost a lot. But if you had groups of industries that could share heat or share materials, suddenly the capacity for being efficient multiplies. And so in cities, you have this really unique opportunity where you have consumers and producers, even if they're not consuming each other's things. You have exporters, you have producers, and you have households, but you have this amazing opportunity of co-locating them and doing really interesting things with that, if you can co-locate them. And so you need some things to co-locate people. And so those systemic interventions are needed to connect sectors together, to consider multiple benefits. So you saw the food, energy, water nexus. If we want to address many things together, people have to be together. And then we now have the tools to integrate across scale. The other thing we've seen in our work in cities is that there's no one size fits all. And this is the concern when you look at things like smart city. The people's gut reaction is like, oh, you're going to give me some tailor-made, some corporation is going to come and put this thing. And that really doesn't work. So we'll see a few slides on that. And then the fifth thing is, are you familiar with virtuous cycles? So if you do one thing, it creates a benefit that cycles back. So it's sort of I guess it's the opposite of vicious cycles, right? So it's virtuous, it's good. And so we haven't yet figured out how you begin the virtuous cycle, but thinking around virtuous cycles is going on in the urban sustainability space. Okay, so example of each of these. This is working the edges, very, very slim wedges. And so this is an example of what we did in Denver. And this was published, I think, in 2012. We looked at a range of voluntary programs, changing light bulbs, giving free Christmas lights, changing insulation, giving rebates for retrofits. And your typical voluntary stuff, this is in the noise. Nothing is happening. But if you did a few other things like behavioral feedback, if you put feedback devices, the real-time feedback devices in every house, then you would get that much. If you did some really strong regulations, like what Berkeley and others have done, saying that at the time of sale of your house should have basic energy efficiency features, you see a bend in the curve. It's very difficult. No city has done that. Guess which 3 cities did time of sale? Berkeley, San Francisco, not even Boulder, and one other California city. And so that's sort of what happened. So Boulder took a twist on it and said, it's a university town, let's make sure all rental properties are retrofitted, otherwise we'll tie it to their rental license. And so there was some teeth to it. But very, very few cities are able to have the capacity. It's also political will. And when we were discussing this in Denver, the mayor at that point actually happened to be a geologist. And he could see that we were all, really wanting to promote this time of sale thing. And he said, our new policy is like fluids and fluid mechanics. And I was like, oh. And he said, you want to avoid friction in the pipes. And so as much as things can go smoothly, you should do pilots. And so this is actually what's happening, that it's very, very difficult to do those sorts of things that would bend the curve. But there is a lot of will to keep on trying. And then you can see that state programs become important because they have created some systems change. This is the renewable portfolio standard, which Colorado passed, Minnesota has, and so on. So where are we thinking now in terms of systemic change and virtuous cycle? We think you should have at least these 4 or 5 things happening. And the first one is good urban density. And I don't want to get into the detail, but it's not only density, but you want to have at least density. Because if you don't have density, you don't have the co-location that we just spoke about. And good density means you don't put your slum people far away, you integrate your informal sector, there's a good balance between jobs, you have, you can walk, bike to get your basic stuff done, maybe you travel by transit to work. So good density, and a number is about bigger than in the US, they say 10 to 12 dwelling units per acre, and in every other country in the developing world, they say it's more than 20 to 30 dwelling units. But that's when it becomes cost effective. You can't do car share. You can't do any of these things without core density. So co-location makes systemic efficiency possible. You could think of industrial symbiosis, which is the exchange of heat and materials across industries, across power plants. And so you can start thinking of the city now as very interesting. Instead of this sort of thing sitting there with the hatched bars getting stuff from outside, you could think of it as this unique place which has capacity to have heat networks, electricity networks, material exchange networks, all of that made possible by social networks because people are keeping track of what's happening. You could do sectoral efficiency. You have to do sectoral efficiency within each sector while you take advantage of this. And then there's, of course, new technologies. And how do we integrate them with traditional practices that are going on in cities? So just a few quick slides on that. So like I said, I don't have results, but this is something we're working on, and hopefully we'll have results in a few soon. I won't say when, but we hope to share this soon. I'm really excited about it. And what we're doing is actually the two questions that people ask is, what are these systemic efficiencies? And what would happen if all cities did it? Because otherwise, it's only one city. And this can actually happen in China, because they could have all cities doing things like this. And what we're looking here is that we've downscaled fairly good data, and we're looking at next generation district energy, which uses low temperature heating, very much like St. Paul district energy. You're looking at different options, making your residences and commercial buildings efficient, increasing industrial efficiency, looking at CHP, looking at this. What can you do? What's the best you can do with practically, reasonable potential, not pie in the sky potential, but practical potential. And then how do you track that to the whole electricity grid and to the country and potentially to the globe? We haven't done that in this project, using input-output life cycle assessment and economic input-output analysis that looks at trade across sectors of the economy. So that's one question we're trying to answer. If you did these systemic things, and if all cities did these systemic things, how far can you get? So both in terms of health, because we're able to calculate local PM emissions, we can calculate health risk within the boundary, and we can also calculate sort of the global greenhouse gas impact. And then if these interventions are effective, it'll need a lot of change to implement them. This sort of exchange, district energy companies are doing it. Beijing is significantly upgrading its district energy. We just saw, so there are business models to do this. There may be legal frameworks to enable them to do this. And that's what this framework is about. It's saying that these big changes won't happen without accompanying changes in the social and institutional system. In fact, they both sort of affect each other. And so this is a coevolution framework by a colleague, Tom Foxon. And it's saying that we should look at all these 5 attributes, just in a broad sense, to see how the social and legal and institutional system can promote this big change, systemic change. And in our project, we've sort of, it was somewhat almost too convenient and too tempting to miss. But our project was on US, China, and India. And the triangle just appealed to me. So you could think of China as this government-led in a very stylized discussion, although there are variations across sector. you could think of the US being market-led, and you could see when we saw infrastructure in India, it was completely like 1,000 blooming flowers. There was just all sorts of innovation happening all over the place, but there was really a hard time scaling because these opportunities weren't there. And so we're looking at this, and I just want to close with one. It so quickly became apparent that you have to be open to diverse solutions, not the one-size-fits-all. And this is an example. We saw so many diverse solutions just in the city of Delhi, which is just one city. And here are examples just for waste management, and they're all doing well. So this is a private sector, public-private partnership mix. It's operated in this area, which is a neighborhood, which is a mix of low to high-tech technologies. The other one is a township where you put all your waste into this machine, which uses a lot of energy and so on, and the waste is completely processed. It's extremely high-tech. It's not clear that they're making money on it, but it's in a much more well-off area. It's in a township that's in the outskirts of Delhi. And then you have the traditional rag pickers, the informal sector collective, who have contracted with the city and with the government in a very low-tech solution. And they came to visit us. And in our whole trip, this was the most powerful meeting. Because he actually came and he said, I've come here to meet you because I know that if someone from abroad writes a report, people pay attention. And he said, why are we informal? Why are you saying we don't have a system? Not that we were, but. And he said they can separate 150 types of paper. They recognize and know how to separate it, 250 types of plastics. And he said, they're not informal. And then the comment he said is, people say we burn the waste, but so do you. The waste-to-energy plant is burning the waste anyway. So why is it okay if you burn it inside the factory and we do whatever? He acknowledged we shouldn't burn it. And so this is just really interesting conversation because it brings you back to livelihoods. It's not only about environment, it's not only about pollution. It is also about who are these people, where are they coming from, this is their transit through the city, and it's their well-being as well. And so that was interesting. And then we had a residential welfare association completely. It was neighborhood done. A military wife started it. She just manages the whole thing. And it's done exceptionally well. And so one of our, you saw a lot of PhD student work here, but two of them are in fact going to take on these 4 case studies and study it using that framework. And so that's all I had. So I'm looking forward to sharing more results with you and invite you to our website. Thank you.
Excuse me. We're going to have questions, and please wait for the microphone so the online people can hear.
Could you please go back to your last slide and the 4th example? Could you say more about how that works and what's going on in that picture with the waste?
So that's a composting pit. And they've set up composting pits in the neighborhood. They still use the rag pickers to sort out all of that. And then this is their remaining organic waste, which they compost in these pits, and they keep it extremely clean. I just wanted to say the informal sector, they want to expand their business. It was a very interesting conversation because when we asked them, what do you think about the government and what do you think about NGOs? He said, oh, the government has the power. It's democratically elected. We want to work with the government, but they don't want to be siloed into only that step of rag picking. They want to manage the whole waste system.
Great talk and great examples. So one of the big problems, obviously, in Delhi and in the cities in India and China is air quality, which is actually driving people out in some cases. What's a path that these cities can take to start to deal with that? I mean, what do you think is the path that they can or that can make some progress on that?
So for China, we're actually tracking that. So we are. So you saw in that systems picture, we can look. So if you look at the PM emission controls that can be put on it, if they did put all the controls, you could improve your air quality vastly. The question is there potential for investment? And so what we were doing in that project was saying, if we combine fuel efficiency through this industrial symbiosis and urban symbiosis, just to give you an example, there's industrial energy use in China is like 70%, and residential commercial like 10%, and the other bit is a little bit of transportation, like 7%. And so we could actually displace all the small boilers that are heating and cooling, heating buildings mostly. So it's sort of consolidating the small boilers because there's so many of them scattered everywhere. It's getting deeper efficiency it's certainly feasible. And my colleague Ted Russell says, the way automobiles are becoming much more efficient. I mean, it's a morbid joke, but he was saying even if you wanted to, you couldn't even commit suicide with an automobile in about 10 years. It's a very morbid joke, but it's getting so the emissions are becoming zero. It's like, what can we actually do is really amazing.
So I just wanted to know how you're able to connect this research to civil society, because from the context of India, city governments can be particularly, so I'm talking about the case of Bangalore and waste management, that they're particularly resistant to change until a sufficient civil society group forms around it. And also in the case of waste, since it's up on the screen,
Yeah.
Segregation at source is something that has been pushed for a lot, that neither industry nor government want.
Yeah.
But it's mainly been rag pickers and civil society who have been pushing for it. So doing these kinds of analyses, how are you able to disseminate it to these different audiences for change?
So in the US, I should probably back up a little bit more. When I first started, I should back up a lot more. I started doing a lot of work on, EWB type projects in rural parts of the world, in India and other parts, Sri Lanka. And what I wasn't fully sure of is how much participation with the elected people we were having. So when I came back, we sort of switched to working with cities in the US, and there's lots of needs here. There's lots of inequities here. And the model we had was to work with cities, so we do analysis with them. A lot of very, what's the right word? It's partnership. It's more than partnership. So we would have meetings with Denver. It was 1.5 years. They would come. Our campus was close to their office. They would come. We would have meetings every 2 weeks. The PhD students were just so excited. Everything they did became city policy or was on tap to become city policy. It was extremely exciting. I think the scale up is tough. Because then how do you multiply that? But I think there's ways around it. So to me, that was the best model, that you don't just go in and give a report, but you're sitting there, you're working through. When we were working with Greenprint Denver, that was deciding on strategies, you could see completely what the politics of it was. So they would have a council, they would put a red dot. All our favorite strategies had red dots because many of them just weren't practically feasible, politically feasible. And then they had green dots and orange dots. It's changed the students. I had students who would, like, the next week come shaved with a haircut and wearing nice clothes. And I'm like, what happened to you? And they said, oh, we have to have credibility with the city. Had like completely spiffy looking students just after going to meet the city for a little bit of time. And so I can't describe it, and I almost miss it now because we're not doing that as much. But I think that happens. And then the trust is so important because that trust is really important. And I felt the same way when the Kabadiwala, when the Waste Pickers Association came. He is looking for a trusted partner. And I said that we will publish, we can't say what you want us to say, we'll publish whatever it is, and he got it. And so that, to me, is really more important than the analytics.
Thank you for the presentation. It was really, really interesting. I have a question on the international summits like the one that occurred in Paris in December. How this kind of events impact directly your research and the results out of it?
So, so cities are very active. In not only Paris and all the COPs, the Conference of Parties previously, I think the first one I went to in Durban was when they signed the Charter for Cities. And so before that, all the IPCC, everything was very nationally based. So I think they've been paying more attention. Some of these greenhouse gas accounting protocols have been helpful to align the city emissions with the national emission inventories and the state emission inventories. I think there's recognition that these solutions would have to be tailor-made, that you can't just sweep across the country and do these things. And that if it's going to happen, it's going to happen in cities. At the same time, you saw that they can only do this much. And so that cross-scale linkage and making that linkage happening is important.
One thing when people talk about infrastructure, they talk about a lot is Lockin, and particularly with a coevolutionary framework, if we sort of think that places where there's technological lock-in, we probably will also have institutional lock-in. So when we have the road system, we have this locked-in government that regulates that. And I know you've thought a lot about resilience and sort of adaptation in the context of cities. So I was wondering if you could sort of share how that piece of your work fits in with these footprints and the rest of what you're doing.
Yeah, that's a really, really, really good question. It's a tough question too. So I pragmatically, I look at it in three ways, right? So I think we have, on some of the other policies, so I also serve on the UNEP with the International Resource Panel, and we're trying to make blueprints, not blueprints, but sort of guidance documents for cities. And I'm actually hopeful because those 60% of cities haven't been built. And so I think there's obviously, you could avoid lock-in, but I'm not so sure because we could be locking in. And so one of the discussions we've actually been having there is, let's not put this sort of Western version of smart cities, because that's a type of lock-in too. So I think the answer is, in many ways, it's probably good for the institutions to be slow and more adaptive and to have that capacity to change. And in some ways, we even unscientifically felt that between India and China, that when something was brought down fully from China, if it was good, it was great. But if it wasn't, it really, it scaled up everywhere. And then in India, you had these 1,000 blooming flowers, and some of them really didn't work, but there was a chance always to course correct. And so there's that whole complexity science piece of it, of saying it looks chaotic, but it's not. And there's structure, there's institutional structure, social structure, and infrastructural structure. It's just not apparent when you see it, because it just looks so. So my thought is that the more social process, the more openness there is, the more opportunities there are to change things, the better would be the lock-in. And then for the third thing that I was thinking is for infrastructures that really lock you in, that you can't change, I think the deliberation has to be much greater as to saying, what can we do? So for example, even the district energy, you could get at it slowly. You could get at it by they already have a very good district energy network. So you could switch that. So thinking about steps. But I have no wisdom beyond that. So, okay.
Do the frameworks that you've developed for life cycle assessment give you the ability to kind of analyze the counterfactual? So if all these people were not in cities, or the 3 billion people who will be in cities 50 years from now instead go to some sort of agrarian utopia or some other framework. Can you evaluate and compare the emissions, the footprints of various things?
So that's also a great question, and I didn't show that here, but there's another paper I should talk about. So when you think of footprints, what I showed you was infrastructure footprints. What is this, the transboundary supply needed to make infrastructure for the whole city? But you can also pass them out into consumption-based footprints, and consumption-based footprints are what supports households in their final consumption. And so we actually just have a paper that should be coming out soon where we compared rural migrants, rural residents, rural migrants in urban areas, and then the rest of the urban people to get a sense. And we used a mix of propensity score matching and multivariable regression to see what would happen. So you can then compare across income levels in different parts. And you could say, if everything else was the same, and I changed this and this. So, and that actually is very interesting. It shows you how much is because of lifestyle and wealth, how much is because of your physical environment, how much could be because you migrated, and you migrated for the purpose of having a better life. And so I didn't show that here, but that with those consumption-based footprints, it's possible.
Okay, I've got 2 more questions over here, and this side of the room has been very quiet, so if there are more questions over here.
We can start over there and alternate for diversity purposes. Hi, I'm an economist. I'm not an urban planner, but if an urban planner were here, they would ask, how involved are you with actual urban planners right now? And in particular, in the Twin Cities, we have, at least in theory, the Metropolitan Council, which tries to coordinate comprehensive plans of all sorts of smaller units. But I have a sense that as I think about what they do and how hard it is they work to try to, sort of not impose, but encourage systematic things across, it feels to me like I would guess they're shooting for maybe 2 times, maybe 2x efficiency rather than the 10x that you say will be necessary by 2050. Could you say a little bit more about how you interact with urban planners?
So in cities that are convening their climate action planning, it's actually interesting to see how well that's connected with their comp plans, the comprehensive plans. So in different cities in Denver, it was patchy. And there's also different motivations. A lot of cities engage. I had, at least anecdotally, I haven't studied this across cities, but cities are also doing it because they realize young people think it's cool. Oh, I'm absolutely serious. And they want to attract sort of young people because they see their economy. So, there's all sorts of reasons why people engage in this. But specifically, so what I'm getting at is I'm not sure that the 10x is what they're going after. They may be going after other things that we're not. And in this area, there's 2 things. So I think we're involved with LHB and the Energy Transitions Lab, and my own group is working with the state of Minnesota to engage with the Met Council to provide this sort of greenhouse gas footprinting and the wedge analysis. And you're right, they're asking just for the wedge analysis, which is not 10x. But that was funded by the DOE, and we're on that. But we have been having separate conversations with Minneapolis and St. Paul on their comprehensive planning, and I think they're meeting on April 1st. We have to work out ways that we could more engage the way, the process I described that I had earlier before I came to Minnesota. I would love that. I miss it. So anyone who has, ways to get us there, I would really like that.
So, very interesting talk, very complicated and complex issues, and I think you've succeeded in making me depressed. So I have a question which I'm not sure is relevant or not, but I think your research is in infrastructure for these cities, smart cities, right? But I wonder if the problem also requires solution in kind of a behavioral change. So the picture you have right in front of us here, all this garbage, right? Does that need to be there in the first place, right?
Absolutely.
And also, behavior could include how we use energy, and it could also include what we eat.
Yeah.
And population growth is something which we don't hear about much, but in the 70s there was this book, Population Bomb. Okay, we don't hear that anymore.
Yeah.
But how would this planet support 9 billion people, right? Cities and no cities, right? So
behavior change is absolutely a really big component, and that's also why you want I said good density. So the good density includes capacity to do all of those things, and it would have to be accompanied. And this is where if your good density matched up with livability and feeling well, and then people felt well, so they went out, and then they felt better, so they walked more. It's the reinforcement that comes from the emotional well-being piece that's really effective. So it was there in the wedges I showed you. I told you that was the tweaking the edges. You shouldn't feel depressed. But in the tweaking the edges, behavior change was there. The trouble is there's so many small actions that everyone has to do, and you can't do that. You can't make rules for everyone to do everything. Change out all your lights, insulate all your roofs, drive efficiently. And so that's where you lose the game. It's just a numbers game. How many people can you get to do what? I mean, it's actually very simple to make those wedges. And then you quickly start seeing, if you knock on doors, so for example, even if you gave someone everything free, they said the best uptake they've had is 50%. This is for light bulbs. If you knock on doors, maybe 6% of the people open the door, and so you just start seeing. And then if your change, if your change is just your furnace is causing a 5% reduction and only 5% open the door, and so that's why behavior change is really important. Tom Dietz, there's a whole lot of literature on the behavioral wedge and how to get that going and how to do more of that through social norming and other things. But I think that's important, but it's one piece of it. And so that's why it's called the social ecological infrastructure. The social piece is important.
In your slide, one of your introductory slides, right before you said today's talk, you had 3 bar charts, and the far one was about mortality. My question is, the last category you had was mortality and energy. I understand transportation, that's easy, we die in car accidents. What's the energy impact on mortality? Can you talk more about that?
It's just the pollution that we were just talking about, from power plants, from industry, from boilers, all of that. Okay. It's high. Particulate matter is actually the prime. And the reason those bars are so big is because so many people are concentrated in cities. If you actually see the same graph, the global burden of disease 10 years back, water and sanitation was huge. So we've got better with the Gates Foundation and all those efforts. But we've also moved so many people. The same co-location that works well, the same co-location also works badly because you have so many people exposed to something.
All right, well, I'd like to thank you all for coming. It's been a great conversation. Let's see. Thank the speaker. Thank you, Anu.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks.
We have our lovely parting gift.
Thank you. I thought you were drinking coffee.
Oh, no.
Okay.
This is all for you. You can drink your coffee or tea out of it.
All right.
We're off next week for spring break. We're back on the 23rd of March with John Linkstein, the Commissioner of the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. And the question he'll be addressing is, are the days of regulating water quality numbered? So have a fun and safe break, and we'll see you back here in 2 weeks' time. Thank you very much.